What is up, everyone? Welcome to the podcast. This is Operation Smarty Pants, where our mission is to acquire knowledge and expand our minds. I am your host, Special Agent Ray, and today we are going to talk about the fastest growing, most exciting, most dangerous sport in the world, mixed martial arts, especially in the context of the UFC, because you kind of can't mention one without the other nowadays. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please stick around to the end of the episode for some shout outs from last week's episode. We are going to get right into it. So this week I watched a documentary called The Hurt Business. I actually watched it with my boyfriend. He is a professional MMA fighter. So he had already seen the documentary. He already knew everything in there. I knew a lot of it because he and I talk about it a bunch. He tells me all about the fight game and what it's like to be a fighter, how the process is, how the business stuff goes, all the nitty-gritty things like that. So I was very interested to see what this documentary had to say about it as well, especially since this documentary is from about 10 years ago. So we're going to get into that, sort of when it was first produced and put out, how things have changed since then. We're going to talk about the history of mixed martial arts in general. It'll be a very basic history, but it does go all the way back to ancient Greece, which is very interesting. Up until now it is obviously one of the biggest sports in the world. I mean, I remember growing up watching the UFC with my family. We would have family fight nights where we'd invite friends over. We'd play with their kids. We'd watch the fights. We'd make food. It was a big whole thing. So I grew up watching mixed martial arts. I actually did martial arts when I was a kid. So I kind of had a familiarity with what goes on inside the cage, what goes on when you're fighting, stand-up versus ground game, boxing versus wrestling and jiu-jitsu. So I've always loved this kind of stuff. I really enjoyed watching this documentary. Like I said, we'll talk about the history. We're going to talk about how things have changed since this documentary was first put out. And we're also going to talk a little bit about sort of the mindset of a fighter and what kind of people they are and what it's like to go through a loss as a fighter. Because I think obviously we know that to win is amazing, but what happens when you lose? I think that's a part that maybe gets lost in the general lights, camera, action of everything, is that one person wins and one person loses. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around. We are going to get right into it. So this documentary called The Hurt Business came out in 2016. Now that is 8 years ago. It is almost a decade old. So if any of the information that I state in this podcast episodes sounds a bit out of date, that's because it is. A lot has happened in the past 8 years since this documentary aired. I'll say, for example, this documentary doesn't even mention Conor McGregor. He's in maybe one shot of training for a fight, preparing for a fight. But other than that, this came out even before McGregor made it big. So that should tell you a lot about kind of where this is placed in the timeline of MMA. And you might say, well, what's the point of watching a documentary from 10 years ago when things have changed now? I think that there is a very good point to watching this, not only just in the interest of seeing how different things were back then and comparing them to how they are now, because there is always something to learn from the past. And some of the people and some of the stories in this documentary have now, 10 years later, faded into obscurity. Some of the people, some of the fighters in here, I hadn't ever heard of before. Now, I'm not necessarily a die-hard UFC fan. I couldn't tell you who won UFC 255 3 years ago and how they won and what their record was. I'm not into it in that way. I'm into it in the way that it is fascinating and interesting and amazing to watch these people put themselves through a very difficult preparation to go in and do something that's even more difficult. And I have a lot of admiration for them and for the process of preparing for a fight and the mindset, things like that. So I know a lot about that. I don't know a lot about specifics and specific people. And again, MMA, the UFC has been around for 30 years now. There's been so many fighters, hundreds of fighters that have come and gone, that have risen to the top and then fallen to the bottom, and now nobody knows who they are. So this documentary also sort of preserves their legacy and their story, and can give you a perspective of people in the past, especially these fighters. And then there's also kind of a realization that even though this was 10 years ago, and even though times were very different, there's a lot of things that stay the same. There's a lot of things that never change. So I definitely think it is valuable to be able to go back and compare and contrast. But let's start with the history of MMA. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, to the very first evidence of this sort of fighting style. So MMA stands for mixed martial arts, which is kind of what it sounds like, taking various martial arts disciplines and combining them into one, not style of fighting, because there's lots of styles of fighting, but one form of competition. So in a mixed martial arts fight, you can use any type of skill or technique or martial art that you are experienced in, that you have practiced, and use that to win the fight. So the first evidence, the first form of martial art, at least that we know of, was called pankration. Pankration. And this started in ancient Greece in 648 BC. It combined boxing and wrestling with a very minimal rule set, and was first introduced in the Olympic Games. And in this form of fighting, pankration singular, fighters, when they had had enough, when they were done, when they were beat, they would submit to their opponent by raising one finger. And this is now the equivalent of tapping out in modern day MMA. And the fighters who would participate in this pankration are kind of the equivalent of what we think of as the gladiators, literally out there in the sand, sweating and bleeding, fighting to the death. And I'm sure that back then it was very well respected. These guys were seen as some of the toughest in society. And I mean, how could you not be? You're literally going in there and risking your life for the chance at victory. That is a crazy thing to do. We are going to jump from ancient Greece all the way up to sort of the start of modern MMA in the early 1900s. There was a type of fighting known as vale tudo in Brazil. Vale tudo means anything goes. So whatever you want to do, however you want to win that fight, you do what you need to do to submit the other person, to beat the other person. These matches had very few rules, and they pitted fighters of various disciplines against each other. So, unlike boxing, where boxing is one sport and one discipline, and you are standing and you are using your hands, and you cannot use your legs to kick the other person, you cannot hit someone below the belt, it's just hands and your head and body shots from there. So that has a very strict rule set. There are a lot of things you cannot do. There are a lot of strikes that you cannot take in boxing. And so, for example, vale tudo, anything goes. You can kick, you can punch, you can take them down, you can do whatever you need to do in order to win the fight. Now, that was very popular in Brazil in the early 1900s. Around this time, the sport and discipline of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was formulated and perfected by Grandmaster Carlos Gracie Sr. and the Gracie family. We have to mention Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when we're talking about MMA because it has had such a huge impact on the fight game, especially when it comes to fighting on the ground. Now, of course, there is Greco-Roman wrestling, which has existed for a long time. That is the sport that is most popular in high school. Like high school wrestling is Greco-Roman wrestling. But Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was something different. So a master named, let me make sure I'm saying his name right. I think it's Mitsuo Maeda, came to Brazil and met with the Gracie family, and he taught Grandmaster Carlos Gracie, who is sort of known as the father of modern Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He taught him Jiu-Jitsu, which Gracie then took and perfected, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was specifically developed for a smaller, weaker, quote unquote, weaker opponent to be able to beat a larger, stronger opponent by using skills and techniques, not relying on strength, but relying on agility and a mental sort of fight intelligence or fight IQ, being able to put a larger person in compromising positions in order to submit them, either breaking arms or legs or choking them out, things like that. So Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was being developed and perfected around the same time that Vale Tudo was very popular, and the Gracies would even engage in this Vale Tudo and go in and fight these larger, stronger opponents. They didn't necessarily have the largeness and the strength and the hand-to-hand combat skills, but they could go in and they could beat these guys with just Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by just using these specific grappling techniques. So once that happened, once these Gracies were in here in Brazil proving that your ground game and your grappling was just as important, if not more important, than being able to fight standing up, then I think that really changed the game. Now we are going to jump forward a little bit, just briefly mention that in the 1960s and 70s, the martial arts master and movie star Bruce Lee sort of made martial arts, especially mixed martial arts, more popular in his movies and things like that. He was kind of combining different martial arts, which definitely influenced the development of MMA as we know it today. And from there, now we're going to jump ahead to the UFC. Nowadays, UFC and MMA are basically synonymous. UFC was the first organization that was able to take MMA and commercialize it and televise it and then make it popular in sort of the modern accepted society. So the UFC was founded by Art Davis and Rorion Gracie. Yes, Gracie as in the Gracie family, one of the descendants of Grandmaster Carlos. And these two guys were the ones who put on the very first televised pay-per-view MMA matches. There were several matches. UFC 1. And this was in November of 1993. So only about 30 years ago. And at the very beginning of the UFC, there were not a lot of rules like there are today. So this is some stuff that I didn't even know. But in the beginning, I think you couldn't eye poke someone. That was one of the main rules. There was one more. Oh, and you couldn't bite. You couldn't poke someone in the eyes and you couldn't bite. Those were the only two kind of like forbidden acts in this first UFC. And it was a tournament. So it wasn't just you go in and you fight one guy. There were 8 people and you had to win multiple times in one night to claim the overall victory. So it was no holds barred. Do what you gotta do to win the fight. Now, there were also no judges. There were no judges scoring the fight. The outcome was determined only by if you got knocked out, if you were submitted, or if you or your corner threw in the towel and tapped out. Which also means that there wasn't a time limit. There were no rounds, there was no time limit. You just went and fought until one of the things that I previously mentioned happened. So fights could go on for, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I doubt that they did, because that's a long time to keep going. But, it was possible, and I'm sure that there were some exceptions. I'm sure that it happened. There also were not any weight classes. So fighters of any size or any weight can compete against each other. So you could have a really big guy fighting a really small guy, and that was, 200 pounds versus 150 pounds. That was fine. That was a appropriate, well, I would say appropriate, not appropriate, now that we're looking back, we're of course, no, you wouldn't do that. But for the time, especially here in the very beginning, that's what it was. That's how they established it. And I mean, also I know that there were a couple of Gracies that came in the early days of the UFC and were able to go up against these larger guys and win. So I'm sure in the moment they didn't necessarily see anything wrong with it, because you did have smaller guys who were winning against bigger guys. There was also no mandatory gloves. You didn't have to wear gloves. You could fight bare knuckle, which today it's interesting. Today there's a whole another division. There's a whole another set of fighting organizations that do this bare knuckle fighting. And originally MMA and the UFC started with bare knuckle. So, like I said, the only ways to win the fights were by knockout, submission, either tap out, either you're getting submitted and you tap out, or a verbal, or I'm sure if you pass out, they're going to stop the fight. Or if your corner throws in the towel, if your corner says, hey, our guy's done, stop the fight, he's too injured, he's not going to be able to continue, stop the fight. And so in this time, the referee couldn't stop the fight. That was not one of the jobs of the referee, is to stop the fight. Again, very different from where we're at today. Very different. And this was dangerous. This was really dangerous, because fighters are not going to stop the fight unless they absolutely have to. Like, unless, they're getting choked out and they're about to pass out, they're not going to stop the fight. They're not going to throw in the towel. They're also going to tell their corner, hey, don't stop the fight. Doesn't matter what happens. Don't stop the fight. Let it keep going. And so the fighters wouldn't stop. The corner wouldn't stop, just because that's how fighters are. They're not the type of people, the type of person you have to be to get in the ring in the first place is not the type of person who's ever going to say, I quit. Unless, like we said, they're about to literally lose consciousness, or their arm is about to snap in half. And even then, just recently, there was a fight. Oh gosh, see, I don't know people's names. I don't know. I can't do names. I can't do exact precise details. But I know that there was a recent fight. I think it was Kevin Holland. He won because he had the guy in an armbar. He literally snapped the guy's arm. You could see it break on TV. The guy didn't tap out. He wanted to keep fighting. The ref stopped the fight and said, hey, you're done. And the guy said, what? I can keep going. Yeah, one arm's broken. I've still got the other arm. So this rule set of, the fighter can tap out or their corner can tap out, that's not going to work, because they're not going to do that. So people were getting hurt. People were getting hurt very, very badly. And because of this very brutal type of rule set and fighting style, there was definitely a lot of opposition, especially political opposition. They mentioned specifically here that John McCain was opposed to MMA. It was seen in sort of the modern popular society as something that was very barbaric, not something to be respected or looked up to as people do nowadays. So at the beginning, it was still a relatively underground sport here in the early 90s. Even still, the first pay-per-view brought in over 350,000 people bought the first UFC MMA pay-per-view. That's a lot of people. Over 250,000 people had never seen this kind of thing before, but had heard about it happening and decided to tune in and say, hey, what's this? Let's check this out. Over 350,000 people. And that's just people who bought the pay-per-view. So there were, I'm sure, more than that actually sitting there physically watching it happen. So that's still a lot. And I think that that speaks to sort of the human nature of being drawn to fighting, being drawn to combat, whether you are participating in it yourself or watching it. I mean, think about back to ancient Greece and Rome, the gladiators. Those people were like celebrities. They were huge. They were respected. They were revered within their society. And, you know, that faded, that type of combat faded and was not as popular over the next couple thousand years, at least as far as I know, not as popular until Vale Tudo and the UFC and MMA comes along. And the first time that it is out there televised, that people can put it on their television screens and watch it, over 350,000 people tune in, which is pretty cool. I think that fighting is in our blood, in our DNA, in our existence as human beings. To some degree, life is about fighting. And it's not necessarily just this physical fighting, combat inside a ring, man versus man. Everybody goes through some sort of fight, and we see it portrayed in movies. Lots of movies are like action movies are about combat and fighting and overcoming something and being faced with challenge and struggle, and to some degree being alone in that there's some level of fight that everyone goes through that is very personal and that you have to do alone, whether that's mental and emotional, whether that is physical, actually fighting someone, or a physical fight when it comes to your health, any sort of health issue or injury or, chronic condition or illness. That's a fight. And that's what we are meant to do. Human beings are meant to struggle and overcome. When we were hunter-gatherers way back when, out there literally hunting down our food, that's a fight as well. Survival is a fight. So when we see when we see that more abstract fight represented literally in these two men stripping down to these tiny little shorts, completely bare, open, vulnerable, entering a ring. The door closes and locks behind them, and they literally are fighting to the death. Something deep and primal and human within us connects to that and sees part of ourself and part of our own life experiences and struggle in what these two men or women are doing. And so we want to tune in. We want to witness that. We want to be part of that as well, because it taps into something that is innate within us. And I think that is why MMA has been the fastest growing sport in the world. I mean, in 30 years, it is now up in the leagues competing with long established sports like the NFL and the NBA and even soccer/football. I mean, soccer/football is huge. I don't know. They even said in the documentary, not sure if we're ever going to be big enough to compete with that, but it is something that now people regularly tune into and the explosion of content and coverage about MMA in the news cycles and online, and these MMA fighters rising to the level of celebrity that is equivalent with some of the highest paid athletes of other various sports, and even fighters jumping into Hollywood and movies and cinema, things like that, just goes to show how big it has gotten in such a small amount of time. And like I said, I think that that's because on some level, anyone can connect. Any human being who has lived enough life to have struggled and fought and overcome challenges, they can watch MMA, they can watch two guys having an MMA fight and have some sort of personal connection to that. Whether they can, whether it's a parallel correlation of, I got into a lot of fights when I was younger, I like watching these guys fight, or it's a more abstract correlation of, I'm dealing with a lot of health struggles, I'm in pain every day, I'm struggling, this feels like a fight, I can connect with what these people are doing here on my screen in the UFC in an MMA fight. So like I said, MMA has grown very, very quickly, and they soon saw the need for a more robust and stricter rule set. And this was headed by, at least according to this documentary, one of the main referees of the UFC, Big John McCarthy. He suggested that they start to implement some more specific rules and weight classes as well. So this led to the development of what we know the modern day structure, where you have weight classes in about 10 to 15 pound increments, and the fighters have to wear gloves, and there's lots of things that they cannot do, like you still cannot bite or eye poke someone, even though a fighter just got bit in the past couple of weeks as of recording this. Even though John Jones eye pokes people all the time, they're still technically illegal. There's certain types of strikes that you cannot do. I think they just repealed this, but for a while you couldn't elbow people straight down. You had to come at sort of an angle. I believe that's changing. But you cannot hit people on the back of the head, because that's a really vulnerable, really dangerous spot that can very quickly lead to concussions and more serious brain injuries. You cannot hit people in the sensitive genital region, which was popular and legal in the past. That is now not popular or legal. People still do it, but they are then penalized for it by the referee. The referee can now stop fights. If a referee sees that a fighter is unresponsive or not fighting back in an intelligent way or gets knocked out, they can jump in, and they're usually the ones at the end of the day who go in and say the fight is over. Whether that is when a fighter taps out, the referee will step in and say, okay, yes, we're done. If a fighter gets knocked out, if a fighter cannot intelligently fight back, that's a TKO. That's when the referee stops the fight. So very different now from the first one. There are judges now as well. So they implemented rounds. They implemented these small breaks in between. If a fight goes the distance, if no one wins by submission or knockout in the allotted time frame, then the judges step in and they will say, yes, this person won or this person didn't, based on their assessment of the fighter's performance in the preceding 3 or 5 rounds. And I think that the implementation of these rules and these structures has helped to curb the opposition and make it seem a little less barbaric and crazy than it was originally perceived as in the past. I don't think it's barbaric at all, but I still think it's crazy. Just the fact that you are going into such a dangerous situation and putting yourself through a ton of potential mental and physical distress and hurt and pain. I mean, that's a crazy thing to do. You got to be a little bit crazy to even get in the ring in the first place. But the rules and the regulations definitely make it more palatable for a casual viewer, even though you still see things like broken legs and arms, lots of blood, open cut lacerations, lots of crazy stuff. But with this rule set and its rising popularity, MMA has advanced very quickly in the past couple of decades, combining and creating various new techniques and implementing other disciplines that maybe weren't popular in the first couple of years. I mean, there's been so many fighters that have come in with new strategies and new styles and maybe other methods of martial arts that were not necessarily popular or well known in the past, but are being now put in on stage and in a spotlight. There have been so many new techniques and new strategies developed just by virtue of MMA being so popular. And so as the popularity rises, then people's interest in becoming an MMA fighter rises. And you have all of these amazing, talented young people who are getting into it and learning about it, learning, ground game, learning stand-up boxing, learning Muay Thai. No, wait, Muay Thai, not Mai Tai. People learning Muay Thai, bringing that in. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is growing and growing and has not stopped growing. So MMA is advancing, and the techniques, they say the game is changing. What worked 10, 15 years ago, the kinds of strategies and techniques that were getting people wins 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even when this documentary was put out, that has since then advanced and changed. And I mean, you see it happen in any sport, I'm sure, but you see these people who were, the top of the top, the cream of the crop way back then, have now been outshined by these new guys up and coming who are advancing the game, who are advancing the types of things that are possible and coming up with new techniques, adapting to the high skill level of all these people coming in. And I mean, that's natural. Like, that happens. I was a gymnast. That happened in gymnastics. If you look at gymnastics 50 years ago to gymnastics now, the things people are doing now is so different, so advanced, so crazy. And that's been happening in MMA just in the past 30 years. All right, I've been talking for a long time. This is going on further than I expected, but I mean, there's just so much to talk about, and I really enjoy fighting. I really enjoy MMA, so I'm enjoying talking about it and telling you guys about it. I hope that you learned something new. I definitely did. That sounds like I'm almost done with the podcast. We're not done yet. I want to talk about probably the most important part of fighting, and that is all the time that you spend outside of the cage as a fighter. Those 15 minutes, 25 minutes that a MMA fighter spends actually in the cage, actually fighting his opponent, that is the smallest fraction of everything that goes into fighting, because you have the months and months beforehand of the training and the preparation and going through fight camp and going through the weight cut. And then you have the months and months afterwards. And if you win, the months afterwards are great, amazing. If you lose, the months afterwards can be some of the hardest months in that person's life. So we are going to talk about two men, Rashad Evans and Michael the Joker Guyman. And I'm going to refer to them as Rashad Evans and the Joker. Now, this documentary looked at Rashad's story as it was in the moment. So in the past couple of years before this documentary came out, Rashad Evans went up against John Jones for the light heavyweight title. John was the reigning champion. Rashad was the challenger. They were former teammates. So that already adds another layer to the fight where they have this more personal connection. And Rashad Evans lost the fight. And he lost that fight. He had a knee injury and he moved to Boca Raton, Florida. He moved to Boca Raton, Florida to recover from this knee injury and to spend time with his family. So he was coming off of a loss. Now, the Joker was a very prolific fighter, and this documentary was looking at him where he is at now. Now, as in 2014 through 16, when this documentary was being filmed and produced. So at that time, he was coming off of a loss, and he had a very, very bad injury. He had been knocked out, and his opponent, after he'd already hit the ground, he was obviously out. The referee was about to step in. His opponent came in and landed one more punch. And as I said in the documentary, basically shattered his jaw, shattered his face, a huge fracture, huge injury that it obviously takes a long time to recover from. And at that point, he was not going to continue fighting. He was basically retired. And that's very tough. That's very tough for a fighter to suffer that sort of injury. And even Rashad Evans coming off of a knee injury, he isn't sure at that point if he can go back to fighting. So both of these men are looking at an end or potential end to their fight career. And that's tough. That's tough for a fighter, because the mindset of a fighter and the kind of person that they are, their personality type, the way that they grew up, it's a very specific type of person. The kind of guy who decides to become an MMA fighter and who gets in the ring and follows through and has a fight career, they have been fighters their entire lives. Their entire lives. It's not just something that they decide to do, but they have either by choice or by necessity been fighters their whole life. They've usually gone through some sort of difficult upbringing, some sort of struggle when they were younger. Maybe they got into a lot of fights when they were kids. Maybe they were, when they were younger, maybe weaker. Maybe they got bullied. Maybe out of necessity, they needed to learn how to defend themselves, learn how to get stronger. There's something in them. And it's very similar to what we talked about earlier, where everyone, the human condition is to be a fighter, to fight in some way. These guys are really doing it, really going through it, and to be faced with the potential end to their career is really difficult. I think there's sort of a stereotype in fighting of the fighter who should retire but doesn't. And we've seen this with, I feel bad even like naming names, but we've seen this with recently Tony Ferguson or Donald Cerrone. In a general public opinion, they were fighting well past the time that they should be fighting, because they have sustained a lot of injuries, because they lost many of their later fights because they weren't fighting as well, as precisely, they weren't as skilled as they were way back when at the height of their career. And were people saying he should retire. It's tough. It's really tough. You can say, it's so easy to say from an outside perspective, yes, he should retire. But, and this was brought up in the documentary, there's two specific points. They enjoy it. They're not fighting because they like to win. They're not fighting because they want the accolades or they want the public approval or public adoration. They're not doing it for those reasons. They're doing it because they enjoy it. Because if they weren't on a big stage, if they weren't getting all this attention in social media and whatnot, they would still be doing it on a smaller scale, wherever they can. Another point that was brought up in this documentary is that this is work. This is work. This is their job. This is their career. They're getting paid to do this. And so that's like going up to, Joe Schmo on Wall Street and saying, oh, you're not as smart as you used to be. You should retire. There's differences because, yes, they are putting themselves in harm's way. There is such a huge physical and mental risk to it. But at the end of the day, this is their job. This is their career. So, who are you as an outsider, as someone who doesn't even fight, someone who just watches and enjoys it and types your little comments on social media, who are you to tell these guys what to do with their life? But of course, I understand the sentiment. I think it comes from a caring place of, you hate to see a guy get knocked out and lose, 3, 4, 5 fights in a row. Like that's very hard. And I think there's a level of empathy that people have with these fighters of you're hurting yourself, so you should stop. But you're not done until you're done, And these fighters are risk takers. You have to be. It's a huge risk. Fighting is a huge risk, not just stepping inside the cage to actually physically fight someone, but the amount of time and energy and money that you invest into your fighting career. In the 6 months leading up to it, you're training super hard. You're paying the gym that you work at, your coach, you may be paying your manager, you might have strength and conditioning coaches, you might have a recovery center or a recovery person that you're paying. You're spending lots of time in the gym, not just practicing your fighting, not just sparring and doing drills and practicing techniques, but you also have to take time to actually just exercise and work out and keep yourself healthy, go for runs, things like that. So just for these 15, 25 minutes that you're in the cage, there are hours upon hours of preparation that go into it. Physical preparation, yes, but also mental preparation. Fighting is 95% mental, 95% psychological. You have to have the courage and the guts and the mental fortitude to put yourself through a ton of training, a ton of hard work, a ton of pain, to go through a weight cut, which, depending on what weight class you're in, and how much you weigh normally, that can be really hard. That can be really difficult. Some guys have to lose, 30 to 40 pounds of weight to make their weight class. Sometimes they lose 20 pounds over the course of 3 months, and then they lose 20 pounds over the course of 1 week. The literal week before they're going into this fight, they have to drop a couple dozen pounds to make their weight class. And I'm sure you know as well as I do that losing weight that quickly is not healthy. It's not healthy. It's not good for your body. It can wreck your metabolism. And on top of all of that, it's difficult. It's so difficult. These guys, they're not eating that last week, barely at all. They'll eat just, to maintain a level of being able to get up and walk around. And even then, sometimes they can't. They're going into the gym. They're going into saunas. They're sitting in saunas in literal sweatsuits that are made to make you sweat. And they're in the sauna sweating pounds and pounds of water weight over the course of just a couple of days in order to get down to their weight class. And that is tough. That's tough. There's a quote that comes out of this documentary from Michael Chandler. He said, "The first fight was making the weight." The first fight was making the weight. That's not a fight against anyone else. That's a fight with yourself. That's a mental fight. That's an emotional fight. That is a physical fight because you literally have to physically force yourself to do something to lose the weight, to get on the bike, in your sweatsuit, to sit in the sauna, to wrap yourself up in blankets, to get in a hot bath that also has salt and alcohol in it, rubbing alcohol that will suck the water out of your body in order to help you drop those last couple of pounds. The weight cut is dangerous. There are people who have died doing the weight cut. Don't fact check me on that, but I'm pretty sure there are people who have died or gotten very, very sick. And I mean, I've been to a couple of weigh-ins with my boyfriend for his fights and seen people who are sick and who can't even stand on their own. They're having people, their arms are slung over their teammates or their coaches' shoulders, and their teammates or coaches are walking them to the scale to weigh in for this fight. And you can tell that they're weak. You can tell that they are mentally and emotionally drained and exhausted and sick. I mean, they're sick. And then the next day they have to go in and fight for their life in an octagon. I mean, it's crazy stuff. It's crazy stuff. You have to be a different kind of animal. You have to be a different kind of person to be not only willing to put yourself through that once, but again and again and again, and to love fighting and to love the sport and to love combat so much that you're willing to put yourself through that again and again and again. And so you go through all of this pain and this work, and you've expended so much time and energy, and there's a chance that you could lose the fight. Every time a fight starts, every time two men go in, one of them comes out victorious. The other one loses. And that's a lot of risk. And if you win, that's a lot of reward. I mean, I'm sure, of course, I have not experienced it myself, but I'm sure that the high of winning, and from what I've heard, it's incomparable to anything else on earth. And what goes up must come down, which means that the blow of losing is one of the worst and toughest things to go through. And in this documentary, Rashad Evans was talking about his injury and his loss to John Jones, and he was saying that he felt mentally drained. He felt, because of the personal aspects, I don't know the full story or the full drama, but he felt betrayed by his team. He was questioning his own ability to even fight and be a fighter. He was questioning what it means to fight. After the Joker had to retire after that heavy loss, he was very depressed. He attempted to take his own life at one point. He's seen a psychiatrist. He is on medication. He said, like, I don't tell my therapist, I don't tell my psychiatrist everything, because if they knew what was really going on in my head, I'd be locked up. So the pain of losing a fight and losing the ability to fight is tough in a way that I cannot describe, because I have not lived it. I have not done it myself. And I can imagine that what these men, Joker and Rashad, and what any fighter, says or expresses about the pain of loss only scratches the surface, barely scratches the surface of the turmoil and the hurt and the pain that they feel, because fighters are tough guys. Fighters are tough guys. They're big, manly men. They're not going to show the depth of their emotions to anyone, not to, someone that they're being interviewed by after the fight, not to the guys making the documentary. I'm sure their true feelings and the actual depth of the pain and of the loss is deeper than anything that someone from the outside could ever imagine or could ever experience. Because it is such a unique situation to be in, to go in there and put in all this time and effort, risk your life. I mean, there have not been deaths in MMA. To a very, very large degree, it is a very safe sport. but it is still possible. Something could happen, something could go left, something you're not expecting. There's been freak accidents. I mean, I've seen in clips people's legs in an actual fight that I was, watching live on pay-per-view. A man's femur was literally snapped in half. I've seen clips of a guy losing a finger because it got caught in the ring. So this kind of stuff can happen. I mean, there was a long time ago a boxer who died after getting knocked out. And that was, I mean, boxing is a whole other story, a whole other can of worms that we're not going to open right now. But it is possible to die. It is more likely to be seriously injured. And I mean, especially after being so close to a fighter and watching someone go through all of that and knowing what happens, I watch MMA very differently now. I see it through the lens of, trying to put myself in the mindset of these men and women and what they go through leading up to it. And like if someone goes out, if someone gets knocked out, and you've got one person up there celebrating, they've won, that's great, that's amazing. There's one person on the ground who needs to wake up. And I am not okay until that person wakes up and is at least up and moving around, because that could be the one time that something happens. That could be the one time, the one freak accident exception that you punch someone just the right way and they were already injured, and something in their brain just snaps and turns off and they're gone and they're done. So needless to say, mixed martial arts is a very dangerous sport undertaken by very strong, both physically and mentally, very strong people who love it enough to risk their lives for it. Again and again, risk their health and safety, risk their mental health. We didn't even talk about like the types of brain injuries you can get, the damage that concussions have on fighters. I mean, please go watch the documentary. There's tons and tons of stuff in here that I didn't even touch on that I think would be valuable for anyone who either wants to be a fighter or is just a fan of fighting and of MMA. There's valuable stuff in here to know. It is free on YouTube. It's called The Hurt Business. We're going to end here today. I could go on, but like I mentioned before, I'm trying to keep these podcasts under 45 minutes at a reasonable, a reasonable time limit. So please go watch for yourself. Let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments below if you've learned anything new. Tell me who your favorite fighter is. You can also find this podcast on Instagram and Twitter at SmartyPantsPod. I would love to hear from you. MMA is such a big ticket hot sport right now, so there's a ton to say, a ton of conversations we can have. I love talking about it. So please come find me there. Like I said, I really hope you enjoyed this. I really hope this was interesting to you. And I will be back next week with another episode. I'm not sure what we're going to talk about yet, so I'll figure it out. But I really enjoyed doing this. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to me talk. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time. Ciao. All right, you guys, time for shout outs. This is from last week's episode. It was part 2 about how your brain functions and talks to itself. So on YouTube, SD Brantman said, wow, this explains the irrational fear some people have about snakes, bugs, spiders, etc. Some traumatic event that happened to an ancestor has been genetically imprinted on their descendants. Wild. I agree, SD Brantman. It is wild. It is so crazy how the brain works. It is so crazy how things that your ancestors did hundreds and hundreds of years ago affect you and the way you are now in this day and age. So it's pretty crazy. It just goes to show that there is so much about the brain and the body that we do not know about. So much more to learn. Thank you for commenting. Anyone else out there listening, if you want a shout out, you can either leave a review with a comment on Apple Podcasts or answer the Q&A on Spotify or drop a comment on YouTube, and I will respond to you there and shout you out at the end of next week's episode. See you guys in the next one.